Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 14. This is the big points lecture for week 13. It's actually a little different this week. What I want to do is basically do the assignment that I gave you last week about critiquing the Eddie Kim article so that you have sort of my perspective on how I would critique it. And you guys did a great job. It's kind of an impossible task. You could have written, 3,000 word article on all the issues that don't get addressed in Kim's article that maybe should. So I wanted to try to synthesize my critique here because this is what I'm going to be doing to your work going forward. All the assignments, and the Kim article was this kind of a warm-up, but all the assignments, including the final for this course, really ask you to take an article and critique it in the context of the class. So that's really our focus, and I thought it would be useful to have kind of an example of how I think through it. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is I'm not interested in critiquing the diet itself, right? All meat, zero carb diet. I'm not interested in critiquing that. We could debate the science. We could look at there's not a lot of evidence that that's useful. We could look at methodologically how it's going to be confusing. You're reading about that this week, the problems in nutritional research and studying diet and health. So let's just assume or agree that it's not really an assumption. Let's just agree that eating all meat all the time is not a sound diet. So let's focus on the article itself and how it critiques this diet or how it describes it. And again, this is both a critique and kind of bigger points from the whole set of readings for the week that I want you to think about. In terms of just an average article that you'd read online, it's pretty good. Okay, we have to admit that. It's got a good lead, the writing is good, it has some energy to it. You don't read sentences that just kind of come out of nowhere or go nowhere. There's a flow to it. It has some depth here and there. It has, historical examples. It has personal anecdotes. It has references to science, competing science research. It has lots of links to things. It integrates with social media, obviously. It has a lot of things going for it. It has a lot of problems. That's what we're going to talk about. So we already know that. So we have to recognize that it's a good article in the sense that you can start reading and think, oh, okay, I want to read this more. And you can easily make it through the end before you get totally bored or it gets so repetitive that you tune out and so on. So the fact that it has some serious merit, at least at the beginning or at first glance, is very important. If it were obvious trash from the beginning, no one would read it and we wouldn't care about it either. Okay? But this is smart enough that it's subtly persuasive in what it's saying. And I don't think Kim is even fully aware of the potentially dangerous tone of his article, which is why I think it's a good article for us to critique, because it's not about this article, right? Everything I'm saying about Kim's article is not about this article. It's about this kind of article, one that sounds smart, one that looks well-researched, that makes a lot of good points, but maybe doesn't follow them up. It's very common. This kind of article is extremely common, and that's why we need to be really careful about how we think about it. So what draws us in? Well, first of all, there's this compelling introduction to Sean Baker. There's no need to rehash that. It's pretty clear in the article. Note Baker's appeal to personal anecdote, right? And the two main examples he gives are really the same kind of creation of expertise we've seen in the past. If this worked for me, nothing else was working, you should try it too, right? We saw this with Cheney. I was gaining weight. I went on a milk and seed diet. I felt better. We saw this with Stephen Gundry and the plant paradox anti-lectin diet. I was running 30 miles a week and going to the gym an hour a day, and I couldn't control my weight, which sounds totally not true to me, but hey, his body. You would think Kim in this article would sort of critique in an article about a particular diet and about a particular person who's become kind of the spokesperson for this kind of diet. You'd think you'd get into that a little bit, right? This sort of personal improvement story. The construction of dietary expertise, especially those that seem to run counter to common sense, have a long history in nutrition, as we've seen. Of course, no comment on this by the author, which would provide very important context for understanding the allure of these claims, right? Would people be as interested in trying an all-meat diet if they saw that the way Baker seems to create expertise is the way that every physician who's had a fad diet has created it over time? Moving on. Not long after the intro, we get this quote: Baker is the crest of a wave of advocates who aren't just arguing for people to give the carnivore diet a try. They're criticizing the entire foundation of nutritional research. This is a big claim, and here the article has a chance to dig into something really cool. What is the foundation of nutritional science? Now, to be fair, he talks a little bit about sort of science later on in the article, but it's at this point where sort of the framing of the article really starts to become bad, for lack of a better term, really misleading and, in a way, I think, kind of dangerous, right, or irresponsible. Is Baker really critiquing the foundation of nutritional science? No. Just because he's doing something different, that's not necessarily a critique. Okay, that's just a rejection. I'm going to ignore mainstream nutritional science and I'm going to do this very extreme diet because it's worked for me. Going against the mainstream isn't a rejection of the foundations. Okay, Baker and the whole carnivore cult that follows him are using nutritional science to bolster their own claims. So they're clearly not rejecting nutritional science. They're using it. They're just using a very small part of it for particular reasons. Okay, and this is an important point. For Kim, there is actual science behind the carnivore diet, and he highlights this kind of towards the end of the article. There's actual science. But what Kim doesn't see is there's just enough science to nudge it out of fiction, and this point is very important. This is one of the big points, right? The easiest way for a researcher in any field to get noticed, history, biology, whatever, is to buck the trend, is to refute long-held wisdom. It's very much the lone genius approach to history that we're used to. And we see it in the history of science and medicine all the time, right? There's continual but banal improvement every day in science, in astronomy, in medicine, and so on. And this sort of continual improvement, which is really boring, is punctuated by incredible breakthroughs, right? Geocentrism, laws of gravity, evolution, relativity, the keto diet, zero carb diet. These are supposed to be paradigm shifts for us, right? Making us rethink how we should eat. So Kim, in the article here, is on the way to making an important point about evidence. Fad diets work because they're nutty, okay? Not like food nutty, but like they use some science, but not too much, right? Otherwise, it's too pedestrian, it's too mainstream, okay? They use just enough science to suggest that everyone else is looking in the wrong direction for their answers. And it's the same reason people like conspiracy theories. It empowers them to know something other people don't, right? It's like recognizing the matrix, for what it is. It raises their cultural standing, right? People now who have this sort of elite privileged knowledge that other people don't, they get it, And that's what fad diets do. It empowers people to think, oh my gosh, everyone's been wrong, and now I have this way of getting something that's been, hidden from me, how to have better health. Like I can do it now. And of course they all fail, but there's always a new one to replace it. But the reason people keep trying these things is because, in part, general ill health for one thing, but because there's this idea that there's this sort of secret knowledge that is now finally being revealed to them, right? That's what conspiracy theories are. We get a brief history lesson. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a Canadian explorer who lived with the Inuit for a while in the early 1900s, writes about it in the 30s for Harper's Magazine, I think, and then publishes a book in 56. And the article actually links to a totally illegal copyright version of the book, all online in a PDF. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting, and it reads very differently than you might expect, given how Kim describes it. Why is this paragraph in here? He's trying to establish a historical precedent, clearly, but why? And to me, this feels like Kim is legitimizing the diet, right? This all-meat diet, Sean Baker, alpha male, huge, hulking dude. I don't know what you do with all those muscles. Why? It feels like Kim is legitimizing the diet. And I point this out because, in my view, this happens all the time. A superficial appeal to history to justify or legitimize something that's happening now, right? This diet may seem totally crazy, but look, people 100 years ago were studying it and thinking about the advantages of a carnivore diet, studying other people, the Inuits that had this, who followed this diet. It's not just some recent crackpot theory. It's been around for 70 years. Wow. So the problem here that you all know from having been in this class, even if you haven't read anything, is that you can always find a historical precedent for everything if you want to find it. Like, it's really not that hard. People have done all kinds of crazy things for a long time. You can find any historical precedent. What's weird about this article is that the historical precedent is really just kind of irrelevant, right? If you want to say a historical weight matters, right, then why aren't we looking at the history of vegetarianism in this article? A number of you mentioned Cheney and Graham promoting vegetarian diets in the 1800s, right? Just from the article, from Kim's article, you think vegetarianism didn't have a history. Right, the carnivore diet's kind of the oldest diet around because it's the only thing he mentioned. Vegetarianism has a much longer history than carnivorism, obviously. From a textual standpoint, one of the first modern vegetarians who argued for vegetarianism was Pythagoras, from like Triangle fame. 600 BC, this is like 200 years before Hippocrates, we have text talking about why people should be vegetarian. It was more of an ethical kind of argument. If historical weight means anything, what do you want, 2,500 years of vegetarianism or 50 years of carnivorism? So if you're going to use history, you got to sort of think a little bit more broadly than just the history of a particular diet, right? You got to look at the history of diets. Another idea that's not explored, there's a lot of talk in the article about weight loss by the two protagonists. It's just an assumption in the article that weight loss should be a part of diet. There's a long historical construction of why that's the case, right? We spent a lot of time talking about why people are obsessed with calories, why people feel like they need to lose weight, even though the correlations between weight and health are very specious. Not part of the article. So I'm pointing a couple of these things out because when I ask you to use history to critique a modern article about diet and health, which is, again, what we're doing for the remainder of the course, it also means, it means two things. Looking at what's in the article, obviously, and many of you did that really well with the Kim critique, but also look at what's left out. And this is where hopefully the course gives you that sort of historical construction and other ideas about sort of topics that are relevant to the history of diet that should filter into any modern critiques or descriptions of diet. So looping back to those previous topics and previous voices we've had in this class will serve you very well on assignments going forward, and that's really the crux of what the final is about. So what else is left out? Environment. Are there consequences of having a all-meat diet? We've read about unintended consequences of GMOs. Rachel Carson talked about the uncontainability of biocides. Right? There's strong environmental impacts for eating a lot of beef. Beef requires 20 times as much land and emits 20 times as much greenhouse gases compared to the same amount of plant protein. Just the beef industry worldwide has a pollution level equivalent to India. There are real consequences for everyone stepping up their meat consumption, right? And this isn't sort of a trivial thing or maybe, an extra butterfly will die. No, like we are fundamentally changing the planet because of beef industry. Okay, so environment is one thing. Here's another quote from Kim about science. To parse out back and forth arguments between pro-carnivore set and the critics could take days, given that each side refutes the other on each point it makes. This makes it look like there's almost this sort of balance of power between, pro-carnivores and anti-carnivores. Like, not true. There's a lot of evidence that an all-meat diet is going to be pretty unhealthy in the long term. And there's virtually no evidence that an all-meat diet is going to be useful. In any case, the diet really isn't about scientific efficacy, right? What else are carnivores, if you're on this carnivore diet, what else are you not eating now? Is it the meat that's giving you the benefits, which is what the science might suggest? Or is it just not eating the other junk that you were eating that science has suggested but not definitively proven to be dangerous? It suggests what Nestle and Nicole from a couple weeks ago were nudging us toward. Eating nothing but meat, which is a crazy, weird diet that you should never do. Is that healthier than the average diet people are moving away from? Now, if that's true, that says a lot, not about a meat diet. It says a lot about what our average diet is now. That's worth thinking about. Literally never addressed in the article. Like, what are you not eating by adapting this carnivore? Another thing that doesn't appear in the article, taste. Baker might not get bored with his all meat steak diet, fine. But that brings up the question of cultural taste. Does Baker take pride in eating nothing but steak? Do other people take pride in eating lots of things? Do some people take pride in eating no meat? How much is our personal dietary choices, especially when they skew towards the exclusion or focus of a particular group, how much is that part of our personal identity? Is carnivorism, this diet here, is it a political statement to reject kale smoothies and the waves of bread baking enthusiasm we've seen during the pandemic? Is it a way of saying, I don't want any, that stuff is dumb. I don't want any part of that. How much about this diet is really just getting out of the mainstream, not just of nutritional advice, but sort of mainstream consumer society or corporate America or whatever. It can't be just that, because obviously if you're just buying steaks at Costco, right, that's one of the big images in the article, you're not really getting outside of much of anything. But again, think back to the conspiracy theory comparison, right? This idea of I'm going outside. I want to be different. I'm special, right? That kind of psyche is a very powerful motivator for a lot of people. One of the most alluring possibilities for discussion in an article about carnivorism has to be about gender and its role in food choice. And we haven't talked a lot about gender in this class explicitly. It's been kind of around, but basically everything we've read. In the subtitle of the article, Kim says, a meat-only diet is sweeping the manosphere, which I don't think I'd ever seen the term manosphere until I read this article. There's lots of women in the article, including one of the two protagonists, right? And there's another history lesson thrown in, actually. O'Hearn notes that she's noticed far more women leading the zero-carb conversation in the last few decades, before Baker came into the debate. So here's two things. One, women have played a central role, which are not at all, besides this one sentence addressed in the article. It has a decades-long history at least, but Sean Baker, the alpha male dude with the giant muscles, is the feature here. Why not the women that started it? He brings up Carol Adams, which is opening a whole new can of worms that he shouldn't have done. Okay, Sexual Politics of Meat, it's a really good book. It's very controversial. It's very polemic. It makes you think. A lot of people disagree with it, but it's very provocative. And one of the things that you probably don't know is what's in that book. And when you read Kim's description of it, he uses this book to reference some biblical references to meat. That's in the book. That's true. But he doesn't even talk about the main point of the book. Killing animals socially justifies violence, especially violence against women by men. That's the point. How much is our society shaped by the fact that we think it's totally okay, that most people think it's totally okay to kill animals just for fun, for our eating pleasure? How much does eating meat suggest that it's a man's right, and most of the people raising animals and killing animals and processing animals are men? How much is it a man's right? This is where the biblical reference comes in. How much is it a man's right to control other bodies for his desires? Does the masculinity associated with killing and eating meat spill over into other areas? If we lived in a totally vegetarian society where all violence, including against animals, was frowned upon, would that lower instances of sexual assault or domestic violence? It's impossible to prove, obviously, but it's very interesting to think about. And this is where, if you're going to talk about a carnivore diet, you should probably do a little research into the gender implications. Begins to conclude with, regardless, it may take decades for us to understand the possibilities and limits of eating only plant protein day after day. Again, we get the suggestion we've seen in Gary Taubes a couple of times that science will actually get us to the truth. Eventually, we will know the truth. We will have the right answers. So there's not a lot of critique in Kim's article. He's sort of pointing out that there is conflicting science, the jury is still out, but conflicting science about nutrition, and especially fad diets like this, is kind of a foregone conclusion at this point, right? So what are we left with Kim's article? Why have I said it's kind of dangerous? Well, for one, we have to realize it's just a story, right? There is no critique. How much of all dietary advice that we read is a story? These resonate with us, right? Especially stories that seem smart and well-informed, and Kim certainly does. He's a good writer, lots of links and so on. We talked about this already. What does this matter for us in this class? What are we supposed to take away from this critique and last week's readings in terms of the class? Compare Wednesday's readings, those critiques on lectins and gluten-free diets. What's the difference between those readings, Wednesday's readings and Friday's readings? The point of you critiquing Kim's article, the point of that assignment was to get you to focus on the differences between what you read in Wednesday and the actual critique of a diet versus what you read on Friday, which was more of a description, sort of pretending to be a critique. So if I had to sum up Kim's article in a word or two, it's missed potential. He has a great topic, fantastic topic, and he doesn't really talk about the issues in any kind of depth. He does bring them up, but it's very misleading in the sense that what you come away with isn't any better understanding of the diet. You don't understand how it's healthy or potentially dangerous. You don't understand how it might be connected to masculinity and gender and violence in a useful way. You don't understand environmental implications of food choice. You don't understand the focus on unintended consequences of environmentalism. You don't understand anything more about sort of why fad diets work or why they're appealing to people. You don't understand construction of expertise. Everything this class is about could be in this article to some extent. Obviously, it would have to be a much longer article. But when you're engaged with a reader, as Kim is, because he's a good writer, when you're engaged with somebody, you have a chance to sort of do something for them. That's what good writing does. It changes the way people think. Okay, but he gives us this very banal description, and sort of what it comes down to is competing science claims, hey, maybe this diet could be useful, right? Now, this is not just a comparison to say Eddie Kim is not Michael Spector, or he's not ready to write for the New Yorker. And I don't mean to pick on him here. Maybe I'm a little bit. That's my job. But the reason it's so important for us to think about this is because it's the kind of stuff we read all the time, right? Again, quick read, well written, it flows well. You can read it fast, lots of good quotes. It's got sort of, interviews. It has some history to it. It considers multiple sides to the issue. It seems relatively objective, right? There's way worse stuff published every day, but he never quite takes the next step, right? And this is what, if you have to sort of summarize the critique, this is how I would put it, is he never quite takes the next step. But I want you to be thinking about how everything you read about diet and health, and in fact, everything you read about everything, like where is it not taking the next step? What are the blind spots? Right? Kim gives us a good way of sort of practicing, applying the class to that kind of thinking. What does this matter for us in the wider world, just beyond this class? What is a reader likely to walk away with? Not much increased understanding about everything. The reader is going to think, we don't know everything. This diet may sound weird, but clearly it works for some people. Maybe I should try it. And it creates a need for dietary advice. It's reinforcing this cultural construction that we've seen built over many centuries, that somebody has expertise that we don't have, nutritionists, dietitians, physicians, and so on, and they need to tell us how to eat. We can't figure it out. We need to listen to them. We need experts like Sean Baker, like Stephen Gundry, like Adkins. Pick any diet, right? All the people we've studied, Cheney. We need people to tell us how to eat. Even though there's some skepticism that Kim has towards the diet, there's just as much endorsement. But are you maybe lowering your health, even if you feel better, right? There's a lot of stories or anecdotes in this article about people feeling better from eating this diet. But as we've seen in previous readings, a lot of that feeling of improvement might be from the stuff you're not eating. It's not because you're eating the meat. It's not the benefits of the animal protein. It's because you're not eating all this other processed stuff, these other things that are in our food that we read about a little while ago. We accumulate the detriments of a limited diet very slowly, just like the potential dangers of GMOs or pesticides and so on. It kind of builds up and creates sort of an ill health of its own. Just because you feel better doesn't mean you're healthier, right? And why are you feeling better? Is it really because of the meat? Is there a causal relationship there? Or maybe the reason people feel healthier is because they're not eating all this other stuff that they were eating before. And if that's true, that's something really worth exploring. That brings us back to kind of the Barabee article on obesity, right? Maybe there's these other things that are kind of in the world that we're not really focused on, environmental factors in Barabee's case. But here, just the fact that we're not eating our normal diet can make us healthier, even if we go to this extreme of eating just meat. Like, that's how bad our diet is now, that shifting to all steak is an actual improvement of our average diet. Like, that's crazy to think about. Right? That's something you'd want to put in an article like this, right? But he doesn't, so he gives the impression that any diet can work, right? That the meat-only diet may actually improve your health on its own. How is history used in the article? I asked you to talk about this, and you did a good job with that. I want to point out what I think this article represents, which is a common problem in articles like this, because history is used as a window dressing. It's just there to sort of give legitimacy to the article, right? Like he's done some research, and in this case, I think give some legitimacy to the diet itself, which I'm not sure is his intent, but it certainly does that. I want to say here, though, that the real value of history is that it allows us to identify and to understand what's at stake with a certain diet, or ways research is conducted, or how dietary advice is disseminated, right? I've mentioned all these before. Environment, politics, science, evidence, expertise, counterculture, right? These are all central to the zero carb diet. When writing about diet, any kind of diet, doesn't address these, what we're left with are just competing science claims and anecdotal evidence about feeling better. And I think it also breeds a general cynicism about diet, and that we do need other people to tell us what to eat, that there is this hidden knowledge that we haven't figured out yet, that science hasn't given us the truth yet, but it will. Maybe I should just keep trying new things. And this sort of cynicism about dietary advice. Well, if the science is always contradictory, then maybe people just go away saying, fuck it, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. I'm not going to care. It doesn't matter. Nobody knows. I'm going to eat just one food group. Make it real easy. Food is just fuel, right? Oh, wait, there's a historical construction for that view, not addressed in the article. So again, this diet writing is typical of what we see all the time. And it's easy to take at face value and think maybe this diet's worth a try. It's easy to think that because the article is so good in many ways. As one student described it, it's creating a false expertise, right, of the author, right? Not just the person giving dietary advice like Sean Baker, but it's the author, Eddie Kim, is creating this false expertise. Like he knows something about diet. Links, contra-evidence, personal anecdotes, occasional dip into history. He gives the impression of a robust approach to understanding this diet. It's easy to think that an all-meat diet is really worth trying, even if it seems weird. This impression that he gives should make us think about one of the points made in the readings for Wednesday about the ethics of publishing this kind of writing. Is this kind of writing helping or hurting our health? I mean, forget about the diet itself. It's not going to make us healthier. None of these fad diets make us healthier. That's just, we know that. But is that creating an understanding diet? Is that creating a dietary culture or changing our relationship to food in a positive or negative way? Should there be implications for people who publish books that give such weird dietary advice that they can actually harm overall health of people? Freedom of speech is good, but there's a point at which misinformation can be dangerous. You may have heard about that in the last couple of weeks. Okay, I talk a lot about raising the bar of our discourse about diet and health, and obviously that's the main sort of big point takeaway for this week is how do we critique this stuff? How do we think about it? How do we talk about it with each other? If you read this article before the class started, you probably would think it fell a little flat, okay? But it is compelling. I hope you agree with me on that. But it's my hope now that you're able to really articulate where and why Eddie's article is problematic, okay? And when you are describing or critiquing relevant issues, make sure you're taking the next step. When you are doing future assignments for this class, especially the final, when you are doing some sort of critique, make sure you're not just mentioning that it relates to X, Y, and Z. Explain how. Explain how history gives us a little bit different perspective. All right, explain how it lets us see beyond just the science research that we have right now, or the rhetoric of a dietitian or nutritionist. Even this week, you're reading a very different article, but much more sciencey, that's really about the history of nutrition. So one of the things you'll notice is that there's a lot about the future of nutrition research. But one of the things that's not critiqued in the article at all is the role of science. And you're reading for Monday how difficult it is to do science research and understand relationships between diet and health. That kind of critique doesn't appear at all in the reading for Friday. And that's one of the things that I hope you'll talk about. But don't just mention that it's not there. Give historical examples of why we should care that it's not there. What can it tell us that just science now can't? This is where history can be so valuable in understanding even competing science claims, because it gives us a broader perspective about why we're asking these questions, how we're framing these answers, how things have changed over time. Okay, so when you're thinking about how to use history in your articles, when I ask you to critique something and use the class, use history, right? Don't just mention that there's a connection. Don't just mention that we've seen this before, right? Give specific examples, specific examples, specific examples, specific examples about the variety of topics that we've talked about that don't show up. You know, roles of science, expertise, authority, and so on, right? How are those addressed or not in a particular article? Now take the next step, right? That's where kind of the Eddie Kim article fails. You never quite get to that next step. I want you to take it. You're prepared now, okay? So it's all about the execution and make sure the history is actually helping to give a new perspective on things rather than be window dressing, right? The superficial history lessons that we get in a lot of dietary advice. Look, there's historical precedent. They don't do anything except give the impression that history is somehow a validation of contemporary understanding. If anything, it shows that we're usually kind of just going down a similar path that has led nowhere previously. It doesn't give us any new answers. It doesn't give us the right answer for sure, but it certainly gives us better questions.
Breakfast time.
That's it. Talk to you soon.